She thought the woman in the worn cardigan had wandered into the wrong cabin. But before this flight touched the ground, everyone in first class would discover that dignity has a way of exposing the people who mistake privilege for character. The soft glow of overhead cabin lights reflected against polished armrests and crystal-clear beverage glasses as passengers settled into the spacious comfort of first class, aboard Aurora Airlines Flight 218, bound for New York City. The gentle hum of the aircraft's climate system blended with muted conversations about business meetings, vacation homes, and investment opportunities, while flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisle with practiced elegance. Leather seats offered generous legroom beneath neatly folded blankets, and plush pillows embroidered with the airline's gold insignia. At Gate 17, priority boarding had already concluded when Grace Bennett stepped quietly through the aircraft doorway carrying nothing more than a faded canvas tote bag and a small paperback novel tucked beneath her arm. She wore a cream-colored sweater, navy slacks, and practical flat shoes that looked chosen for comfort rather than appearance. Her shoulder-length blonde hair rested naturally around her face, and there was a calm steadiness in her blue eyes that suggested someone entirely comfortable with herself. Yet the moment she entered the first-class cabin, subtle glances began moving in her direction. A woman seated near the center section lowered her designer sunglasses and studied Grace openly. Victoria Hastings had built her identity around appearances. Her tailored suit, diamond earrings, and polished confidence announced success before she ever spoke a word. Beside her sat Richard Coleman, a seasoned businessman who often measured worth through visible symbols of achievement. Victoria leaned slightly toward him and lowered her voice just enough to sound discreet without truly hiding her words. "Do you think she realizes this is first class?" she whispered with a faint smile. Richard followed her gaze toward Grace before suppressing an amused expression. "Perhaps she is looking for economy," he replied quietly. Nearby passengers exchanged uncertain glances. Some pretended not to notice. Others watched with curiosity they could not entirely conceal. Grace glanced down at the boarding pass resting in her hand before locating her assigned seat only 2 rows ahead of Victoria. She lifted her tote bag into the overhead compartment with gentle efficiency and settled into her seat without hesitation. The whispers behind her continued. "Maybe someone upgraded her by mistake," Victoria murmured. "It happens." Richard chuckled softly. "I suppose everyone enjoys pretending once in a while." Grace stared out the oval window beside her seat where airport vehicles moved steadily beneath the morning sun. She heard every word. The cabin around her remained filled with polished laughter and subtle judgments disguised as sophistication. Yet she neither defended herself nor acknowledged the commentary floating through the air behind her. Instead, she opened her paperback novel and carefully marked the page she intended to begin reading. A flight attendant approached with a welcoming smile. "Good morning, ma'am. May I offer you something to drink before departure?" Grace returned the smile with quiet warmth. "Water would be lovely. Thank you." The attendant nodded and walked away. Behind Grace, Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Interesting," she said softly. "No champagne." Richard smirked. "Maybe she is trying very hard not to attract attention." Grace gently closed her eyes for a brief moment before reopening them and returning her gaze to the sunlight spilling across the runway outside. Because sometimes the people most certain they understand who belongs in the room are the very ones about to learn how little appearances truly reveal about the human heart. The cabin settled into a polished rhythm as first-class passengers adjusted cashmere blankets, organized tablets, and resumed conversations wrapped in the effortless confidence that often accompanies privilege. Outside the oval windows, airport ground crews moved with practiced efficiency beneath the morning sun, while the aircraft remained parked at the gate awaiting final clearance for departure. Grace Bennett rested quietly in her seat, the paperback novel unopened in her lap and a glass of water balanced carefully on the tray beside her. The subtle whispers behind her had not stopped. If anything, they had grown bolder. Victoria Hastings crossed one elegant leg over the other and glanced once more toward Grace before leaning toward Richard Coleman. "I still cannot understand why airlines do this," she murmured with a restrained smile. "First class used to mean something." Richard adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket and lowered his voice just enough to create the illusion of discretion. "Perhaps standards have changed," he replied. "Maybe they handed out complimentary upgrades at the gate." Victoria laughed softly. If that is true, they should at least explain the dress code. A few nearby passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. One older gentleman pretended to study a business magazine while clearly hearing every word. A younger woman seated across the aisle shifted uneasily before looking toward Grace with quiet sympathy. Yet no one spoke. Grace lowered her eyes briefly toward the boarding pass tucked inside her novel. She had flown often enough to recognize this particular form of judgment. It rarely arrived through open hostility. Instead, it appeared disguised as observation, humor, and harmless curiosity. She could have corrected them. She could have introduced herself differently. She could have listed accomplishments, associations, and explanations capable of silencing the whispers immediately. Instead, she simply took a slow breath and looked back out the window. A flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Miss Bennett," she said softly, "would you care for anything else before departure?" Grace returned the kindness with genuine appreciation. "No, thank you. Everything is wonderful." Victoria noticed the use of Grace's last name and raised an eyebrow. "Interesting," she whispered to Richard. "At least she remembers to be polite." Richard smirked. "Good manners are free." Grace heard the remark and gently folded her hands together atop the closed paperback. Finally, she turned slightly in her seat, not with irritation but with calm sincerity. "Excuse me," she said softly, her blue eyes steady and kind. Victoria appeared surprised to be addressed directly. "Yes." Grace hesitated for only a moment. "Have I done something to offend either of you?" The question landed with unexpected force. There was no accusation in her tone. No wounded pride. Only quiet curiosity. Richard cleared his throat and forced a smile. "Not at all," he replied quickly. Victoria's polished composure flickered. "Of course not," she added. "We were simply talking." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "I see." Her gaze moved briefly between them before returning to the sunlight illuminating the runway outside. "Sometimes people decide who belongs somewhere before learning anything about them," she said softly. "It is a difficult habit to recognize in ourselves." The younger woman across the aisle lowered her eyes. The older gentleman slowly closed his magazine. Victoria straightened in her seat. "I assure you this has nothing to do with you personally," she replied. Grace offered a gentle smile. That is usually what people say when they do not realize it has everything to do with the person sitting right in front of them. Silence settled over the first-class cabin as the aircraft hummed quietly beneath them. Leather seats absorbed the discomfort hanging in the air while several passengers suddenly found the view through their windows more interesting than the conversation they had chosen not to interrupt. And 30,000 feet above the ground had not yet arrived. But already the journey ahead was beginning to reveal that true class has very little to do with the seat assigned on a boarding pass. The quiet that followed Grace Bennett's question lingered through the first-class cabin with surprising persistence. The soft glow of overhead lighting reflected across polished tray tables and crystal beverage glasses, while passengers shifted in seats upholstered with buttery leather, designed to symbolize exclusivity and comfort. Outside the oval windows, airport vehicles continued their measured choreography beneath clear morning skies. Inside the cabin, however, something less visible had begun moving through the rows between strangers. Discomfort, reflection, curiosity. Grace returned her attention to the paperback novel resting in her lap, opening it carefully to the page she had marked earlier. Her movements remained calm and unhurried, as though the whispered judgments surrounding her had become little more than distant static beneath the steady hum of the aircraft. Victoria Hastings adjusted the silk scarf draped around her neck and forced a composed expression. She had expected embarrassment, perhaps irritation. Instead, the woman seated only 2 rows ahead had responded with grace that felt impossible to challenge without exposing something unpleasant about herself. Richard Coleman loosened his grip on the financial magazine he had been pretending to read. "She certainly has confidence," he murmured quietly. Victoria lowered her voice. "Or stubbornness." Yet even she no longer sounded convinced. Across the aisle, the younger woman who had been observing the exchange finally leaned slightly toward Grace. "I thought what you said was very kind," she offered softly. Grace looked up from her novel and smiled. "Thank you." The younger woman hesitated. "I do not think I would have remained so calm." Grace considered the statement for a moment before closing the book once more. Most people are carrying burdens we cannot see, she replied gently. Sometimes judgment says more about pain and fear than it does about cruelty. Victoria overheard the comment and shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had spent years cultivating elegance, achievement, and influence. Yet no one had ever described her as kind. The realization unsettled her more than she cared to admit. A flight attendant moved gracefully through the aisle offering warm towels and departure updates. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced with practiced warmth, "thank you for your patience. We are awaiting final confirmation before closing the cabin door." Passengers nodded politely and resumed their routines. Laptops reopened. Messages were checked. Conversations resumed in cautious tones. Yet the atmosphere remained altered. Grace turned another page in her novel before pausing to gaze out the window once more. Beyond the glass, she watched baggage handlers move purposefully beneath the bright sunlight. She had always found airports fascinating. Thousands of people crossing paths while knowing almost nothing about one another. Celebrations, goodbyes, new opportunities, private grief. Every gate carried stories invisible to passing strangers. "May I ask you something?" the younger woman across the aisle said carefully. Grace looked toward her. "Of course." The woman hesitated. "Why did you not defend yourself earlier?" Grace folded her hands atop the closed novel. "Because not every misunderstanding requires a performance," she answered softly. "Sometimes people reveal who they are when you give them enough silence to hear themselves." A hush settled briefly over the surrounding seats. Even Richard lowered his magazine slightly. Victoria stared ahead, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened aircraft window. The confidence she had worn so effortlessly now felt less secure beneath the weight of Grace's quiet wisdom. Moments later, the intercom crackled gently overhead. Flight attendants exchanged quick glances before one nodded toward the front of the cabin. Passengers barely noticed the subtle shift. Grace did. She looked toward the aisle with mild curiosity as footsteps approached from beyond the partition separating the cockpit from first class. Somewhere near the front of the aircraft, a familiar voice exchanged greetings with the crew. The sound carried no urgency, only recognition. Yet before the plane ever left the ground, the people seated in first class were about to discover that assumptions have a remarkable way of collapsing when truth finally decides to board the flight. The subtle shift that moved through the first-class cabin was almost impossible to explain, yet nearly everyone sensed it. Flight attendants who had moments earlier focused on beverage service exchanged quick, respectful glances toward the front galley. One of them adjusted her uniform jacket before smoothing a strand of hair back into place. Another quietly checked her tablet and nodded toward a colleague. The gentle murmur of conversation softened beneath the steady hum of the aircraft waiting patiently at the gate. Grace Bennett noticed the change without reacting to it. She simply rested her hands atop the paperback novel in her lap and watched sunlight stretch across the runway outside her window. Years of traveling had taught her that airports and airplanes operated through invisible rhythms most passengers never noticed. Behind her, Victoria Hastings observed the crew's behavior with growing curiosity. "What is happening?" she whispered to Richard Coleman. Richard glanced toward the front of the cabin. "Perhaps a celebrity is boarding," he suggested. Victoria straightened slightly in her seat. "Or someone important." Nearby passengers exchanged speculative glances. The older gentleman folded his business magazine neatly. The younger woman across the aisle looked toward the galley with quiet anticipation. Even those pretending not to pay attention became more alert beneath the polished calm of first class. Grace lowered her gaze to the novel and gently traced the edge of the bookmark tucked between its pages. She remained entirely composed. A flight attendant approached the front row before pausing respectfully as though awaiting someone's arrival. Soft footsteps echoed faintly from beyond the curtain separating the boarding area from the premium cabin. Victoria adjusted her diamond bracelet and instinctively checked her reflection in the darkened screen of her tablet. Richard straightened his tie. Whatever was unfolding, they wanted to be prepared to greet it appropriately. Grace, meanwhile, closed her novel and slipped it carefully into her tote bag. She reached for her glass of water and took a small sip before setting it back onto the tray. The younger woman across the aisle glanced toward her. "You do not seem curious," she said quietly. Grace smiled softly. I find that surprises have a way of arriving whether we chase them or not. The younger woman laughed gently. I wish I could think like that. Grace's blue eyes softened. Life becomes lighter when you stop trying to control every unknown. Victoria overheard the exchange and shifted uncomfortably. The simple woman she had dismissed now carried herself with a confidence untouched by approval or status. It unsettled her in ways expensive experiences never had. Suddenly, the lead flight attendant appeared at the entrance to first class with an expression that blended professionalism and unmistakable warmth. Good morning, she said softly to someone beyond view. It is wonderful to have you with us. Several passengers angled subtly in their seats. Richard leaned ever so slightly into the aisle. Victoria held her breath. The footsteps drew closer. Grace turned her head toward the sound, and for the first time since boarding, a genuine spark of affection brightened her expression. She did not stand. She did not wave. Yet something in her eyes transformed completely. The older gentleman lowered his magazine entirely. The younger woman across the aisle stared openly now. Victoria's confident smile faltered as a distinguished figure emerged from the front of the aircraft exchanging familiar greetings with members of the crew. There was no dramatic announcement. No grand introduction over the intercom. Just quiet recognition woven into every interaction. The man paused briefly to thank a flight attendant by name before continuing down the aisle. One by one, conversations faded into silence. Leather seats absorbed the tension building beneath polished appearances as his footsteps carried him closer to Grace's row. And without realizing it, the passengers who had spent the morning deciding who belonged in first class were seconds away from discovering that the most extraordinary people often have the least interest in proving themselves to strangers. The man moved through the first-class cabin with an ease that suggested familiarity rather than performance. He greeted flight attendants by name, thanked a crew member for assisting a passenger earlier that morning, and paused briefly to ask another employee about her daughter's college graduation. There was no entourage surrounding him and no expectation that people should notice his presence. Yet the quiet respect reflected in every interaction drew attention more effectively than any grand entrance ever could. The polished confidence Victoria Hastings had worn throughout the morning began to crack beneath growing uncertainty. Richard Coleman straightened his posture and studied the distinguished figure approaching down the aisle. Do you know who that is? Victoria whispered. Richard narrowed his eyes. I think I have seen him somewhere before. Around them, subtle shifts moved through the cabin. The older gentleman lowered his magazine completely now. The younger woman across the aisle watched openly, curiosity replacing hesitation. Even passengers pretending to focus on phones and laptops occasionally glanced upward. Grace Bennett remained seated beside the window, her tote bag tucked neatly beneath the seat in front of her. For the first time since boarding, the reserved expression she carried softened into unmistakable warmth. The corners of her eyes brightened with affection. She looked less like a passenger enduring an uncomfortable flight, and more like someone waiting patiently for a familiar face after a long day. The footsteps stopped beside her row. The man smiled immediately upon seeing her. It was not the polished smile reserved for business meetings or public appearances. It was genuine, relaxed, and filled with quiet devotion. There you are, he said warmly. I have been looking everywhere for you. Grace's expression transformed completely. I thought you might be busy, she replied gently. He chuckled softly. You know I always make time for you. A hush swept through first class. Victoria's lips parted slightly. Richard leaned forward without realizing it. The younger woman across the aisle blinked in surprise as Grace stood from her seat and accepted the man's embrace with effortless familiarity. There was no dramatic display. Only the comfortable affection shared between two people deeply accustomed to one another's presence. How was boarding? He asked. Grace hesitated briefly before offering a small smile. Interesting, she answered. The man noticed the careful choice of words immediately. His expression shifted, not toward anger but concern. Interesting, he repeated softly. Grace glanced around the cabin before returning her attention to him. People sometimes make quick decisions about strangers, she said. Nothing that cannot become a lesson. He studied her face for a moment, understanding far more than she had spoken aloud. Then he nodded gently. I am sorry if your morning was anything less than pleasant. Victoria stared openly now. Something about his voice stirred recognition she could not yet place. Richard's face slowly lost color as realization began assembling itself piece by piece. The older gentleman whispered beneath his breath. A flight attendant standing nearby lowered her eyes respectfully. Grace touched the man's arm reassuringly. I am perfectly fine, she said. People reveal themselves eventually. He smiled at her with unmistakable admiration. That is one of the many reasons I love you. Silence settled heavily over the cabin. Leather seats absorbed the growing tension while sunlight streamed through the aircraft windows, illuminating expressions transformed by confusion and disbelief. Because somewhere between whispered assumptions and practiced elegance, the passengers surrounding Grace Bennet had just witnessed a truth they never expected. The simple woman they had underestimated was not waiting for validation from strangers. She had simply been waiting for the man who knew her worth long before anyone else in first class thought to ask her name. The silence that followed felt heavier than the pressurized air surrounding the first-class cabin. Grace Bennet remained standing beside her seat with one hand resting lightly against the canvas tote tucked beneath the armrest while the distinguished man beside her looked around with the calm awareness of someone accustomed to reading a room without commanding it. The gentle glow of overhead lights reflected against polished tray tables and crystal glasses that now sat untouched. Victoria Hastings stared openly, her carefully maintained composure slipping further with every passing second. Richard Coleman blinked several times as fragmented memories collided inside his mind. The familiar face. The way crew members greeted him by name. The quiet deference woven naturally into every interaction. Then understanding arrived all at once. Richard inhaled sharply. That is James Bennet, he whispered. Victoria frowned. Who? His voice lowered even further. James Bennet, chairman and majority owner of Aurora Airlines. The words landed like a sudden drop in altitude. Victoria's expression froze. Across the aisle, the younger woman covered her mouth with trembling fingers. The older gentleman lowered his head slowly, realization softening his features. Nearby passengers exchanged stunned glances as the truth rippled silently through the cabin. James Bennet seemed entirely unaware of the effect his identity produced. Or perhaps he simply refused to center himself within it. He turned his attention back to Grace with gentle concern. You mentioned this morning had lessons attached to it, he said softly. Should I ask what happened? Grace hesitated before offering a small smile. People made assumptions, she replied. Nothing that cannot teach something valuable. James studied her expression carefully. Did anyone treat you unkindly? Grace's blue eyes drifted briefly toward Victoria and Richard before returning to him. I would rather say they treated appearances as facts, she answered. Most people never realize how often they do that. Victoria's face lost its remaining color. She remembered every whispered remark, every dismissive glance, every joke shared behind polished smiles. The elegant confidence she had relied upon all morning suddenly felt painfully fragile. James nodded thoughtfully. That habit causes more damage than many people understand, he said quietly. He glanced around the cabin, his voice never rising above conversation level. An airline carries people through some of the most important moments of their lives. Weddings, funerals, job interviews, family reunions, military homecomings, medical emergencies. We rarely know what another passenger is carrying emotionally before they take their seat. No one interrupted him. Flight attendants stood respectfully nearby. Richard lowered his gaze to his folded hands. Grace looked at James with unmistakable affection. That is why I like traveling this way, she said gently. Without introductions. Without titles. James smiled softly. You remind us whether our values exist when nobody believes they are being observed. Victoria finally found her voice. It emerged barely above a whisper. You fly without telling people who you are? Grace turned toward her. I prefer meeting people before they decide whether I matter, she replied. A hush swept through first class once more. Leather seats absorbed the discomfort settling between strangers who suddenly understood the weight of their earlier choices. James slipped his hand into Grace's and squeezed it gently. There was no triumph in either of their expressions. No satisfaction in exposing anyone. only quiet sadness that dignity so often depended upon recognition. Outside the aircraft windows, baggage carts rolled beneath bright morning sunlight. Inside the cabin, passengers who had measured worth through clothing, confidence, and appearances were left confronting a far more difficult truth. The woman they had underestimated had never needed first class to prove her value. But first class had revealed exactly who everyone else chose to become when they believed nobody important was watching. For several long seconds, nobody in first class seemed capable of speaking. The steady hum of the aircraft blended with the distant sounds of airport activity outside the windows while sunlight filtered through the oval panes, illuminating faces transformed by disbelief. Victoria Hastings remained perfectly still, her fingers tightening around the stem of the untouched glass resting on her tray table. Richard Coleman stared downward, avoiding the reflection in the darkened screen of his tablet, because he no longer recognized the certainty he had carried only minutes earlier. Grace Bennett quietly returned to her seat beside the window as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. She smoothed the sleeve of her cream-colored sweater and placed her paperback novel gently onto her lap. Beside her, James Bennett settled into the neighboring seat with the relaxed ease of someone who valued presence over performance. The younger woman across the aisle finally gathered enough courage to speak. "You really travel like this?" she asked softly. Grace looked up and smiled. "Like what?" The younger woman hesitated. "Without telling people who you are." James glanced affectionately toward his wife before answering. "Grace prefers honesty that arrives before introductions." Grace lowered her eyes briefly before speaking. "People are often kinder when they know who you are supposed to be," she said gently. "The difficult question is whether they would offer that same kindness without the title attached." Her words settled heavily throughout the cabin. Victoria felt her cheeks grow warm beneath carefully applied makeup. She had spent years refining social instincts she considered sophisticated. Yet those instincts had failed the simplest measure of character. Richard finally cleared his throat. "Mrs. Bennett," he began quietly. Grace turned toward him. There was no resentment in her expression. "Yes." He struggled to maintain eye contact. "I owe you an apology." Victoria closed her eyes briefly before opening them again. "So do I," she whispered. The cabin remained silent. No passenger shifted. No flight attendant interrupted. Even the older gentleman who had quietly witnessed everything folded his hands and listened. Victoria drew a slow breath. "I judged you before learning anything about you," she admitted. "I assumed your appearance told me your story." Grace listened without interruption. Richard lowered his gaze. "I believed I could recognize who belonged in this cabin," he added. "I was wrong." Grace looked between them for several moments before speaking softly. "Most people do it," she said. "Not because they are evil. Because assumptions are easier than curiosity." James watched his wife with quiet admiration. She had every opportunity to expose, embarrass, or condemn. Instead, she searched for understanding. Victoria's voice trembled slightly. "I cannot stop replaying everything I said." Grace's blue eyes softened. "Then perhaps you will remember it the next time someone walks into a room and does not look the way you expected." A flight attendant standing nearby blinked back unexpected tears. The younger woman across the aisle lowered her head thoughtfully. Richard nodded slowly. "I think I will." Grace smiled gently. "That is all anyone can ask." James rested his hand lightly over hers. "The airline business is often described through schedules, destinations, and service standards," he said quietly. "But what we truly move is humanity. Every seat carries someone's joy, fear, grief, hope, or exhaustion." He glanced around the cabin. "The way we treat strangers matters because we rarely understand what they are carrying." The hush that followed felt different now. Not heavy with embarrassment, but softened by reflection. Beyond the windows, the runway shimmered beneath the morning sun. Inside first class, people who had boarded believing status defined worth began understanding that elegance without compassion is merely decoration. And somewhere above the noise of assumptions and appearances, a simple woman reminded an entire cabin that respect offered before recognition is the purest form of class. The atmosphere inside first class softened into something almost unrecognizable from the tension that had filled the cabin earlier that morning. The gentle hum of the aircraft remained constant beneath the polished elegance of Aurora Airlines. while sunlight streamed through the windows and stretched across folded blankets, leather seats, and untouched glasses resting on tray tables. The sharp edges of judgment had begun giving way to reflection. Grace Bennet leaned back comfortably in her seat beside the window, her paperback novel resting closed in her lap. James Bennet sat beside her with quiet attentiveness, occasionally exchanging warm smiles with crew members who passed through the aisle. There was nothing performative about either of them. No effort to command attention. No desire to prolong anyone's embarrassment. Victoria Hastings stared down at her hands before finally gathering the courage to look up again. The polished confidence that had once defined every word she spoke had been replaced by humility she had never expected to find 30,000 feet above the ground. "Mrs. Bennet," she said softly. Grace turned toward her immediately. "Yes." Victoria swallowed carefully. "Can I ask you something?" Grace nodded. "Of course." Victoria hesitated before continuing. "When you realized what I thought about you, why did you not tell me who you were?" Several nearby passengers glanced toward Grace, curious about the answer themselves. Grace considered the question thoughtfully. "Because I wanted you to meet me before meeting my circumstances," she replied gently. "If respect only appears after introductions, then it is not really respect." Silence settled over the cabin once more. Richard Coleman lowered his eyes. The younger woman across the aisle brushed away tears she had not expected to shed during a routine flight. James watched his wife with unmistakable admiration. Victoria's voice trembled slightly. "I have spent years believing I was good at reading people." Grace offered a compassionate smile. "Most of us believe that," she said. "But human beings are not headlines. We are stories still being written." Richard finally looked up. "I do not think I have ever considered how many people I overlook every day," he admitted quietly. Grace folded her hands atop her novel. The cashier working a late shift. The tired parent traveling alone with children. The elderly passenger moving slowly through the airport. The person wearing inexpensive clothes. Everyone carries experiences we cannot see. James nodded. "One of the first lessons I learned in this business is that airlines do not merely transport passengers," he said. "We transport human moments. Excitement. Anxiety. Loss. Hope." He glanced around the cabin. "The way we acknowledge one another during those moments matters more than most people realize." Victoria blinked back tears before offering a small, uncertain smile. "I think this flight changed me." Grace's expression softened. Then something good came from an uncomfortable morning. Nearby, one of the flight attendants quietly squeezed another crew member's hand. Even the older gentleman who had observed everything from behind his magazine lowered his head thoughtfully. The aircraft finally began pushing back from the gate, the gentle motion signaling the beginning of the journey ahead. Outside, airport workers continued their routines beneath bright blue skies. Inside, passengers who had boarded carrying assumptions now carried something far more valuable: perspective. Grace turned toward the window and watched the terminal slowly drift behind them. She thought about how often people spent their lives trying to appear impressive, while forgetting the extraordinary power of simple kindness. Victoria followed her gaze before whispering softly, almost to herself, "I hope I remember this after we land." Grace looked back at her with calm sincerity. "The people who change us rarely do so through perfection," she said. "They change us by reminding us who we still have the chance to become." And as the aircraft prepared to leave the ground, the first-class cabin discovered that true elevation has never been measured by status, privilege, or the seat printed on a boarding pass. It begins with the quiet decision to see another person before deciding what they are worth. The aircraft gathered speed along the runway beneath a sky washed in soft shades of blue and gold, and within moments, the city below began shrinking into a mosaic of streets, rooftops, and tiny moving lights. Inside first class, the familiar sounds of departure surrounded the passengers. The engines hummed with steady confidence. Seatbelts rested securely across laps. Flight attendants completed final checks with practiced grace. Yet the greatest journey taking place that morning had nothing to do with miles traveled between airports. It had unfolded quietly between strangers seated only a few feet apart. Grace Bennet gazed through the oval window as clouds drifted beneath the rising aircraft like waves of white silk stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The paperback novel remained untouched in her lap. Beside her, James Bennet reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining naturally with hers. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Grace smiled without looking away from the sunlight illuminating the clouds below. "I am," she replied. "I was thinking about how quickly people decide who someone is." James nodded thoughtfully. "And how often they regret being wrong." Grace finally turned toward him, her blue eyes calm and bright. "The beautiful thing is that people can choose differently next time." Several rows behind them, Victoria Hastings sat quietly in reflection. Gone were the polished observations and whispered judgments she had once offered so effortlessly. She thought about every stranger she had passed through airports, restaurants, hotels, and waiting rooms. The elderly woman dressed simply. The exhausted father traveling with restless children. The nervous young graduate asking questions. The people she had dismissed without realizing they possessed entire worlds beyond her assumptions. Richard Coleman stared out his own window, seeing little of the landscape beneath the clouds. "I spent years believing success taught me how to understand people," he admitted quietly. Victoria lowered her eyes. "Perhaps humility teaches us better." Across the aisle, the younger woman smiled faintly as she listened. Even the older gentleman who had hidden behind his business magazine earlier in the morning appeared lighter somehow, as though a lesson he had long forgotten had finally found its way back to him. A flight attendant approached Grace and James with genuine warmth. "Thank you both for flying with us today," she said softly. James returned the smile. "Thank you for taking care of everyone on board." Grace glanced toward the flight attendant and added gently, "Kindness is remembered more than perfection." The attendant blinked back unexpected emotion before nodding gratefully and continuing down the aisle. Silence settled over the cabin once more, but it no longer carried embarrassment. Instead, it held understanding. The kind that arrives when people stop defending who they thought they were and begin considering who they still hope to become. Grace looked through the window one final time before opening her paperback novel. "Do you think they will remember?" James asked quietly. Grace turned a page and smiled. "People forget many things," she answered. "But they rarely forget the moments that reveal something true about themselves." Beyond the clouds, Aurora Airlines Flight 218 continued its journey toward New York City, carrying executives and retirees, dreamers and worriers, strangers and families, each with invisible stories no boarding pass could explain. First class had promised luxury through spacious seats and polished service. Yet the most valuable thing offered that morning had been far simpler. It was the reminder that class is not measured by wealth, appearance, or privilege. It lives in patience extended to strangers, in curiosity offered before judgment, and in respect given long before titles are introduced. The woman they laughed at had never needed status to prove her worth. Instead, she reminded everyone around her that dignity should not have to be earned through recognition. And as sunlight filled the cabin above an endless sea of clouds, the passengers of Flight 218 discovered that the highest class in the world is not printed on a boarding pass. It is revealed in how we treat people when we believe they have nothing to offer us in return. The cabin went silent, and somewhere high above the earth, humanity found its reflection in the kindness of a simple woman.